The Chelyabinsk testing ground was a kingdom of industrial winter. The air, sharp with the bite of frost and the perpetual tang of coal smoke, carried not the thunder of artillery, but the symphony of the Soviet war machine, the distant shriek of saws, the monolithic hammering of presses, the hiss of steam from locomotive workshops. Here, deep in the rear, the war was manufactured, piece by brutal piece, in a cordoned-off sector, separated from the orderly rows of fresh T-34 hulls by a fence of barbed wire and silent sentries. A singular tank awaited its creators. It was a wolf among wolves, but one bred with a different set of fangs. Lieutenant Alexei Voronin stood before it, the winter sun glinting dully off the new commander's insignia on his collar. His promotion was still fresh, smelling of ink and opportunity. He was a mathematician by training, a man who believed in solutions, in superior force applied with precision. The order to command this experimental detachment was, to him, a complex equation with a promising result. Beside him, Sergeant Pavel Zhigarev, the gunner, crouched, his engineer's mind already reverse engineering the foreign apparatus welded to the hull. His fingers, calloused from metal and mechanics, traced the welds not with awe, but with a critical assessment of their quality. The loader, Nikolai, a mountain of a man from the Siberian taiga, stood with arms crossed. His silence was not emptiness, but a deep reservoir of observation. He missed nothing, understood much, spoke little. His brother had died inside a burning T-34 at Kursk. And then there was the driver, the man known only as Mikhailich. He was not standing. He was sitting on an overturned crate, rolling a cheap, hand-rolled cigarette, his eyes fixed not on the tank's modified front, but on its tracks, on the familiar sag of the suspension. His face was a landscape of the Eastern Front. A pale scar from shrapnel grazed his temple. His knuckles were a map of old breaks and burns. He had driven the 34 from the desperate defenses outside Moscow to the muddy hell of the 43 counteroffensives. To him, the tank was an extension of his own body. The roar of the V2 diesel was its heartbeat. The clang of the gears, its voice, the smell of hot oil and cordite, its breath. This new appendage, this thick pipe-like snout replacing the trusted hull machine gun, was a prosthesis. Unnatural. It spoke of a war he did not yet know, a war that smelled, even now, of the faint, sweet, chemical odor leaking from the tank's new internal seams. The briefing officer from the Special Design Bureau was a man of blueprints, not battlefields. His voice was flat, cutting through the cold. The OT-34, the Object, Ognemetny, the ATO-41 system. He spoke of capacity in liters, of pressure in atmospheres, of effective range, 100 meters maximum. He described the viscous fire mixture, a cocktail of kerosene and thickener. He explained the electrical ignition, the compressed air propulsion. He called it a key for stubborn locks, bunkers, pillboxes, fortified houses. He used the word cleansing. He did not mention what the fire would sound like when it met flesh. He did not explain how the mixture burned at over 1,000 degrees Celsius, or how it clung to surfaces and burned until there was nothing left to consume. The training was a brutal ballet of adaptation. Inside the hull, the world changed. The familiar cramped space now housed a new, sinister organ, a pressurized steel tank mounted behind the driver's seat. It emitted a low, liquid gurgle with every movement of the vehicle. The once predominant scent of male sweat diesel and gun oil was now forever tainted by the cloying, volatile smell of the fire mixture. It was a smell that got into your mouth, coated your tongue. Mikhailich, at his controls, felt the tank's soul altered. It was heavier in the front, responding to his levers with a sluggish reluctance, like a beast sedated. Every bump transmitted a slosh from the tank behind him, a constant reminder of the volatile cargo they now carried within their own armor. The first live fire test was ordered for late afternoon, when the long shadows would make the flames stark against the snow. The target was a simulation, a crude facsimile of a German Unterschlupf, a dugout made of logs and packed earth nestled against a barren hillside. Dirty snow, stained with oil and soot, crunched under the tank's tracks as Mikhailich maneuvered it into position. The engine's familiar growl was a small comfort. Through his narrow, scratch-prone periscope, he could see the wooden structure. It looked laughably flimsy. He thought of the concrete monsters he knew were waiting in East Prussia, the ones described in intelligence briefings, with steel doors and interlocking fields of fire. This was a toy. Inside the turret, the atmosphere was electrically tense. Voronin's voice crackled over the intercom, cool, analytical. "Driver, halt. Gunner, stand by flame projector. Loader, keep a high explosive round ready in the breech. Standard protocol." Standard. There was nothing standard about this. Pasha's hand hovered over the new, red-painted trigger switch on his panel, his jaw muscles tight. Nikolai, following orders, had already loaded the main gun, the solid clunk of the breech block, a familiar punctuation in the strange silence. Mikhailich waited. He watched a lone crow lift off from a skeletal birch tree in the distance. Voronin's command was a single quiet word: fire. What happened next was not a weapon being fired. It was a cataclysm being unleashed from a steel pipe. First, a hydraulic mechanical hiss, the sound of a giant pressurized lung exhaling. Then the world outside vanished behind a roaring, liquid nightmare of orange and black. It wasn't a stream. It was a rolling wave, a tidal surge of flame that seemed to have weight and substance. It didn't arc. It slammed into the wooden bunker with a deafening, tearing roar that swallowed all other sound. The structure didn't ignite piece by piece. It was simply erased, enveloped, drowned in an instant in a boiling cauldron of fire. The snow around it didn't melt. It exploded into billowing clouds of superheated steam. The very air writhed, distorted by the heat, creating shimmering, demonic mirages. The light inside the tank became chaotic, a violent disco of orange and black shadows leaping across the faces of the crew, across the ammunition racks, across the sacred image of St. Nicholas that Nikolai had secretly welded to a bulkhead. The torrent ceased as abruptly as it began. The hiss died, leaving a ringing, absolute silence that was somehow louder than the inferno. The tank's engine, forgotten, idled with a pathetic, mundane chug. Through his periscope, Mikhailich stared. Where the bunker had been stood a grotesque, pulsating sculpture of blackened, glowing timber. Thick, greasy coils of smoke, black as a moonless night, twisted and climbed into the purple twilight sky. He had seen tanks brew up, the quick, violent explosion of ammunition and fuel. He had seen men on fire running. This was different. This was a deliberate, almost artistic act of total consumption. It left no wreckage, only ash. It was slow, thorough, and terrifyingly intimate. It didn't just kill the target. It unmade it. No one spoke over the intercom. The only sound was Nikolai's ragged, controlled breathing and the soft, repetitive click of Pasha's trigger finger, still twitching over the now dead switch. Voronin mechanically recorded the data in his logbook. Time, duration, estimated fuel expenditure. But his hand trembled, just slightly. The mathematical equation had been solved, and the answer was a primal scream. Mikhailich finally looked away from the viewport. He slowly removed his padded leather helmet. His hair was plastered to his scalp with cold sweat that had nothing to do with the engine's heat. The chemical smell of the fire mixture inside the hull was now fused irrevocably with the new, far worse smell seeping through the ventilation slits. The acrid, sweetish, and deeply repulsive odor of burnt wood, earth, and something else. Something that smelled like the future. He understood now. The design bureau officer was wrong. This was not a key. A key opens a door. This was an eraser. It didn't open the bunker. It deleted the men inside it from existence. They were no longer tankers. They were no longer just soldiers. The machine they inhabited was no longer a T-34. It was a vessel for a different kind of terror. As the dark Urals night swallowed the last of the smoldering glow on the hillside, the new identity settled into the steel hull with them, colder and heavier than the armor plate. They were the keepers of the flame, and their war had just begun, in a silence more deafening than any blast. The journey to the front was not a triumphant charge, but a slow, grinding descent into a different reality. The world outside their train car windows bled from the vast, snowy expanses of the deep rear into a scarred, monochrome landscape of war. Forests became jagged toothpicks of blackened timber. Villages were not simply destroyed. They were erased, leaving only geometric outlines of foundations and the occasional surreal chimney stack standing sentinel over nothing. The air, even inside the sealed train car carrying their precious OT-34, began to taste of cinders and a cold, damp decay. The crew watched in silence, each man processing the vista of ruin through his own lens. Voronin saw tactical challenges and avenues of approach. Pasha calculated the strain such terrain would place on tracks and suspension. Nikolai's face was stone, but his eyes tracked every broken home, every frozen ditch. Mikhailich simply smoked, his gaze distant. He had seen this before. This was the old war. He waited for the new one to reveal itself. They detrained at a shattered railway junction under a leaden sky. The front was close now. The muffled thunder of artillery was a constant, irregular heartbeat in the distance, felt in the chest as much as heard. Their tank was driven off its flat car by a sullen, grease-stained mechanic from the reserve battalion who eyed the flame projector with a mixture of curiosity and profound distrust. "Here's your beast," he muttered to Mikhailich, not to the officer. "Hope you brought your own hell to throw. You'll need it." The words hung in the frigid air. They were assigned to a combined assault group earmarked for the reduction of the Heilsberg fortified area, a bristling line of interlocking concrete and steel that guarded the approaches to Königsberg. Their new home was a captured German farmhouse cellar, its walls sweating with damp, the ceiling so low Voronin had to stoop. The atmosphere here was thick with the smell of wet wool, cheap tobacco, and the sharp, metallic scent of fear that veteran infantry exuded. These were men from a rifle company, their faces pale, eyes hollowed by exhaustion and something else, a kind of resigned dread. The introduction was not ceremonial. The company commander, A Captain Gromov, with a limp and a voice raspy from constant shouting, pointed a grimy finger at a crude sand table model in the corner. It depicted not open fields, but a labyrinth of lines, dots, and hardened squares. "Your sector," Gromov said, his eyes lingering on Voronin's clean uniform. "The Germans aren't in trenches here. They're in the earth. Concrete coffins." He tapped a cluster of squares marked in red chalk. "These are the Panzer Nestor, armor nests, steel cupola machine guns. And here," his finger moved to a larger menacing circle, "is what they call a B-work, a combat block. Meters of reinforced concrete, armored doors, ventilation systems. It's a fortress. My men have bled against it for 3 days. 3 days for 50 meters of mud." He then looked directly at the T-34 crew, his gaze a physical weight. "They tell me you have a new toy, that you can cook them out." The word cook fell into the cellar's silence with a terrible, specific gravity. "We'll see. You'll support the morning attack. Your job is the Panzer Nest at grid 7-3. Clear the eye so we can blind the brain." That night, under a moon obscured by haze, the crew conducted their first reconnaissance. They went not in their tank, but on foot, crawling with a scouting party through a communication trench that stank of mildew and excrement. The world narrowed to the feeling of cold, wet clay under their bellies, the sound of their own breath, and the occasional spine-chilling snap of a flare being launched into the sky. When it burst, freezing the landscape in its stark, white-green light, Mikhailich saw it. There, 200 meters ahead, rising from a low, manicured mound of earth, was the Panzer Nest. It was not a dramatic castle. It was a low, sinister hump of gray concrete, almost organic, like the carapace of some buried insect. A single dark slit, the machine gun embrasure, stared blindly across the corpse-littered no-man's land. It was utterly silent, utterly still. It radiated a malevolent patience. He had faced Tiger tanks, their cannons terrifying and majestic. This was different. This thing didn't move. It simply waited. It demanded you come to it and die on its terms. As they slithered back, a burst of machine gun fire from another sector ripped the night. Not the frantic tat-tat-tat of a light MG, but the slow, deliberate, hammering thud-thud-thud of a heavy German MG-42 from inside one of those concrete tombs. It was a sound of pure mechanical efficiency, of industrialized death. It went on for a full 10 seconds, then stopped. The ensuing silence was heavier than the noise. Back at the farmhouse, they passed the battalion's own tank support, a platoon of standard T-34 85s. The crews were gathered around a small, desperate fire, burning splinters from a shattered barn. Their tank, one of them, was missing. Not destroyed nearby, but gone, sent to the rear with a catastrophic penetration. A young driver with soot smeared across his childish face was talking, his voice trembling not with fear, but with a furious, helpless anger. "Just sat there," he was saying to no one in particular. "We hit the slope, Popov's tank ahead of us. There was a flash from that hump on the left. Not even the main bunker. A fucking side hump. A direct hit. Engine block. They brewed up in seconds." He looked up, his eyes finding the new arrivals, finding the unfamiliar silhouette of their tank in the gloom. His eyes held no camaraderie, no hope. They held a challenge. "You're next." Mikhailich walked to their T-34. In the dark, it looked less like a machine and more like a primordial creature, its flame projector snout pointed at the ground. He placed a hand on the cold armor. He thought of the concrete hump, the silent embrasure. He thought of the mathematical certainty of the MG-42's fire. He thought of the young driver's shattered eyes. The design bureau's clean theories of keys and cleansing had evaporated, replaced by the damp, cloying stench of the trench and the image of an insectile concrete hive waiting to swallow them. The equation Voronin loved had changed. The variables were no longer range and pressure, but fear, concrete, and the absolute, patient hatred embedded in a fortified line. The new war had a face now, and it was a gray, silent mound under a freezing moon. Their beast was awake, and it was hungry, and tomorrow they would have to feed it. Dawn did not break over the Heilsberg line. It seeped in, a grudging gray dilution of the night. The world was a study in muted horrors, dirty snow, blackened earth, the skeletal remains of trees, and the omnipresent, clinging mud that was the color of dried blood. The air was still, cold, and pregnant, with a silence that felt like the holding of a collective breath. Inside the T-34, that silence was a physical entity, thick with the smells of cold metal, sweat, and the ever-present, sweet chemical taint of the fire mixture. Mikhailich sat in his driver's compartment, a cocoon of familiar levers and gauges that now felt like a betrayer's den. The pre-startup rituals were mechanical, performed by muscle memory, checking the fuel, priming the oil system, his hands moving, while his mind replayed the image of the concrete hump from the night before. Outside, through his periscope, he watched the infantry. Captain Gromov's men were forming up in the trench line, their movements sluggish, devoid of the frantic energy of an assault. They moved like men already condemned, checking weapons with numb fingers, avoiding each other's eyes. Their glances towards the lurking snout-nosed tank were not looks of relief, but of grim curiosity, as if watching a dangerous, untested animal being led to the pit. Voronin's voice crackled in the headphones, stripped of all its previous academic calm, replaced by a tight, wire-strung tension. He relayed the final coordinates, the assault sequence. The plan was simple, a brutal arithmetic. Artillery would pepper the area, not to destroy the panzer nest, but to keep its occupants' heads down. Under this scant cover, the T-34 would advance with infantry support, get within 70 meters, and neutralize the target. The word neutralize echoed in the stale air. The artillery barrage came, a sudden, violent cacophony that shook the ground. Dirt and snow geysered ahead of them. It was their cue. Mikhailich engaged the clutch, pushed the throttle levers forward. The V2 engine roared to life, a sound that normally meant power, movement, agency. Today it felt like a death knell. The tank lurched forward, breaking from its camouflaged position, its tracks chewing into the frozen crust of no man's land. Through his vibrating periscope, the world became a bouncing, chaotic jumble. He saw the infantry pour over the trench parapet, a gray-brown wave moving with reluctant, painful slowness across the open ground. He focused on the terrain, on avoiding shell craters that could belly-trap them, his driver's soul taking over, seeking the path of survival. They had covered half the distance when the artillery lifted. The sudden quiet was more terrifying than the noise. It was in that vacuum of sound that the panzer nest awoke. A bolt of bright white flame spat from the dark slit. Not the muzzle flash of a cannon, but the distinctive, incandescent streak of a German Panzerfaust. fired from a secondary embrasure they hadn't spotted. It missed their hull by meters, exploding against a shattered tree stump with a concussive crump that rattled their teeth. Then, the main weapon spoke. The heavy, rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the MG-42 in the steel cupola. Tracer rounds, glowing a malignant green, snaked towards them, ricocheting off the frontal armor with sharp, angry spangs that echoed inside the hull like demonic bells. The infantry ahead of them went to ground, pressed into the mud by the withering fire. "Gunner, traverse left. Target the main embrasure." Voronen's voice was a shout now, fighting the din of bullets on steel. Pasha, sweat already beading on his forehead, cranked the handwheel, the electric motor whining as the turret, with its menacing pipe, swung ponderously. The tank was a magnet, drawing the machine gun fire. Nikolai, his face a mask of concentration, had already loaded a high-explosive shell into the main gun. A silent backup plan. Mikhailich kept moving, weaving, presenting a harder target. The periscope glass in front of him starred as a bullet struck it, a spiderweb crack obscuring his view. He drove now by instinct, and the narrow, clear slivers of vision left to him. The distance closed. 100 meters. 90. 80. The concrete hump loomed larger, the dark slit now clearly visible, a dead, black eye. "Range 70! Flame projector ready!" Voronen commanded. His finger was on his commander's override trigger. Pasha's thumb hovered over his switch. The moment stretched, elastic and unbearable, filled with the hammering of the MG-42 and the roar of their own engine. Fire! What erupted from the T-34 was not the controlled torrent of the testing ground. This was violence unleashed in anger and terror. The hiss was swallowed by a deeper roaring whoosh as a thick, jellied river of flame vomited from the projector. It didn't arc gracefully. It slammed into the mound of earth before the concrete, erupting into a climbing wall of fire that instantly engulfed the base of the position. For a second, nothing changed. The MG-42 kept firing. Then the world changed. The fire, seeking oxygen, crawled, flowed, and seeped. It found the ventilation shafts, the narrow gaps around the embrasure's steel plate. It wasn't just burning the outside. It was being inhaled by the fortress itself. The machine gun fire stuttered, then stopped abruptly. A different sound emerged, faint at first, then unmistakable. A high, metallic screeching from inside the concrete. The sound of a red-hot steel plate warping, followed by a muffled, unhuman scream that was cut off with horrific suddenness. But the dragon was not satisfied. Voronen, his eyes wide, held the trigger. The jet of flame played across the concrete face, blackening it, turning it into a blistering canvas of hell. It found the secondary Panzerfaust port. The mixture shot inside. A secondary contained explosion blew the small steel door off its hinges, vomiting a fireball back out into the morning air. Then it was over. Voronen released the trigger. The silence that followed was absolute, profound, and deafening. No machine gun fire, no screams. Only the crackle of burning earth, the hiss of snow vaporizing, and the idle chug of their tank. Mikhailich, through his cracked periscope, saw the result. The panzer nest was no longer a gray hump. It was a smoldering, blackened altar. Thick, oily black smoke poured from every orifice. The main slit, the secondary port, ventilation pipes they hadn't even known were there. The smell invaded the tank, bypassing the filters. The acrid stench of burnt concrete, seared metal, and something profoundly organic and vile. Outside, the infantry rose from the mud. They did not cheer. They did not advance with renewed vigor. They moved slowly, cautiously, their weapons held loosely, their faces pale with a shock that went beyond the relief of survival. They stared at the burning bunker, then at the T-34, with a kind of religious terror. They had witnessed a duel between steel and concrete, and it had ended not with a bang, but with a consuming, silent feast of flame. They had seen a tomb turned into a crematorium in seconds. Inside the turret, Pasha stared at his hand, the one that had activated the circuit. He flexed the fingers slowly, as if checking they still belonged to him. Nikolai crossed himself again, his lips moving in silent prayer, his eyes fixed on the burning smoke outside the vision block. Voronin was writing in his log, but his entries were jagged, chaotic. He wrote, "Target neutralized." Then he crossed it out. He wrote, "Target incinerated." Mikhailich put the tank in reverse, backing them slowly away from the still crackling ruin. The tactical triumph was complete. The Panzernest was dead, its eye forever blinded. But as he guided the beast back, he felt no victory. He felt like a man who had opened a door he could never close, and glimpsed an inferno that now lived not just in the tank's belly, but in his own. The dragon had breathed its first breath in anger, and the taste left in all their mouths was of ashes and a terrible newfound power that felt indistinguishable from damnation. The success at the Panzernest did not bring glory. It brought a heavier, more complicated silence. Captain Gromov's report cited effective suppression by specialized armor, a dry phrase that hung in the cellar's damp air, like the lingering smoke from the bunker. The riflemen no longer looked at the T-34 crew with detached curiosity, but with a wary, almost superstitious distance. They shared their Makorka tobacco, less freely. The crew had become untouchables, wielders of a power that was as horrifying as it was useful. They were quartered slightly apart, their monstrous machine a constant brooding presence at the edge of the camp. Their next objective was the heart of the problem, the B-work, the combat block designated Kugelblitz on the German maps. It was not a solitary hump, but the central node in a spider web of trenches, minefields, and mutually supporting positions. Aerial reconnaissance photos, grainy and stark, showed a massive, low-slung concrete rhombus with multiple armored cupolas, anti-tank gun embrasures, and a labyrinth of surrounding wire. It was a small, independent kingdom of death. The failure of a direct assault 2 days prior was evident in the scarred earth before it and the lingering smell of corruption from the unrecovered dead. Voronin, now operating with a cold, feverish focus, pushed for a night approach under smoke. He believed in the element of surprise, in the mathematical perfection of getting within optimal range before the enemy could react. The plan was approved. As dusk bled into a moonless, starless night, Mikhailich guided the T-34 forward, a blind beast in a shroud of artificially generated fog that smelled of phosphorus and chalk. The world shrank to the glow of his instrument panel, the feel of the ground through the controls, and the whispered directions from Voronin, who navigated by compass and dead reckoning. The tension was a wire stretched to breaking. Every bump could be a mine. Every shadow in the swirling gray could conceal an anti-tank gun. They emerged from the smoke screen too far to the left. Instead of facing the main block's frontal armor, they were exposed on its flank directly before a smaller, secondary concrete structure they had missed on the photos. A machine gun caponier, interconnected with the main fort by an underground tunnel. It woke with a sudden, vicious fury. Not with the heavy thud of a large gun, but with the sharp, spiteful crack of a 37mm anti-tank gun hidden in a camouflaged embrasure. The first shell was a deafening, bell-like clang on the turret side, a hammer blow that knocked the crew sideways in their seats, filling the hull with the smell of scorched paint and strained metal. The shock wave rang in their skulls. Nikolai was thrown against the breech of the main gun, a grunt of pain lost in the chaos. Before they could orient themselves, a second shell hit, lower, on the forward glacis plate. It did not penetrate the thick sloped armor, but it ripped a jagged gash in the steel and, with a shower of sparks, severed a critical external fuel line. Diesel began to spray onto the hot engine deck, a ticking clock towards an internal fire. "Reverse! Reverse now!" Voronin screamed, not in command, but in raw survival instinct. Mikhailish, ears ringing, yanked the levers. The tank lurched backward, tracks churning the mud. The 37mm gun fired again, the shell whining past them to explode harmlessly in the darkness. They retreated into the blessed cover of a shallow depression, the acrid smell of diesel now mixing with the other familiar stenches. The assault was over before it had begun. They were wounded, bleeding precious fuel, and the dragon had been denied its breath. The walk back at first light was a funeral procession. They abandoned the immobilized T-34 temporarily, a gutted leviathan. The infantry, under covering fire, eventually secured the area enough for repair crews to approach. As Mikhailish supervised the frantic work of replacing the fuel line and assessing the turret damage, a deep, brutal dent that had jammed the traverse mechanism by 3 degrees, he studied the fortress. In the cold morning light, he saw its true anatomy. It was not a single target. It was an ecosystem. The main block was a mountain, but it was defended by foothills. The caponiers that had fired on them, hidden foxholes with grenade launchers, trenches that allowed enemy soldiers to scuttle like rats to new firing positions. He saw the small, mushroom-like ventilators protruding from the earth, far from the main structure. He saw the heavily reinforced steel doors, flush with the ground, for resupply or sorties. This was not a lock to be picked. It was a living, breathing organism with a million eyes and a hardened shell. The revelation came not from a briefing, but from the mud. A patrol brought in a prisoner found shivering, half-frozen, and delirious in a collapsed communication trench. He was not a fanatical SS man, but a gaunt, middle-aged Obersoldat from a rear area supply unit, caught in the wrong place during the last push. He was broken by terror and exhaustion, his uniform caked in the same filth as theirs. He was interrogated not in a command post, but near the repair site, within sight of the damaged T-34. The man's eyes, wide and white-rimmed with panic, kept darting to the tank, to the distinctive, thickened barrel of the flame projector. He babbled in a mix of broken Russian and German, pleading. His words were translated by a weary political officer. He spoke of the garrison inside Kugelblitz, not with pride, but with pity. They were trapped, he said. Command had wired them orders to fight to the last. But he spoke of something else, a new fear that slithered through the trenches faster than any rumor. Word had come from other sectors, from survivors of attacks near Memel, of Flammenpanzer, Russian tanks that breathed fire like dragons from old tales. They spoke not of shells or bullets, but of a liquid hell that seeped into vents, that cooked men alive in their steel and concrete coffins, that left bunkers as silent, smoking ovens. The prisoner's voice dropped to a whisper. His eyes locked on the OT-34. Die nennen es der Schlangenkuss. The political officer paused, then translated flatly. They call it the serpent's kiss. The phrase hung in the cold air. Voronin, who had been listening while examining a schematic, stopped. Pasha, wiping grease from his hands, froze. Nikolai stared at the ground. Mikhailich lit a cigarette, the match flame trembling slightly in his fingers. In that moment, their understanding of their weapon transformed for the second time. First, it had been a technical solution. Then, a terrifyingly effective tool of slaughter. Now it was something else entirely. It was a psychological specter, a ghost story told by their enemies in the dark. The fortress before them was not just a physical obstacle of concrete and steel. It was also a prison for men who had already been sentenced, in their own minds, to a specific, horrifying kind of death. The fear of the flame was a tangible force, as real as the 37-millimeter gun that had torn into them. As the repair crew finally signaled the tank was operable, Mikhailich climbed back into his driver's seat. The dent in the turret was a permanent scar. The knowledge in his mind was another. They were no longer just attacking a position. They were performing an exorcism on a fortress haunted by its own dread. The dragon in their belly had a name now, whispered in German in waterlogged trenches. And that name, the Serpent's Kiss, was a weapon all by itself. Voronin looked from the schematics to the fortress, a new, calculating light in his eyes. The equation had changed again. The next attack would not be about brute force alone. It would be a performance, a theater of terror, where the mere sight of their silhouette might be as potent as the fire itself. A new, unspoken doctrine was born in the cramped, oil-stained interior of the OT-34, forged in the silence that followed the prisoner's words. The blunt instrument had to become a precision tool of psychological annihilation. Voronin, his mathematician's mind now fixated on this new variable, fear, began to craft a grim liturgy. The goal was no longer just to destroy the bee-work, but to dismantle the will of every man within a kilometer of it, to turn their formidable concrete shell into a transparent coffin, where they could see their fate approaching with slow, deliberate steps. They began with the outlying sentinels, a small, half-forgotten German observation post, little more than a reinforced dugout with a periscope, nestled in a copse of shattered trees to the left of the main fortress. It was a tactical footnote, but Voronin selected it as the first subject. The attack was scheduled for a bleak, overcast afternoon. Visibility poor enough to muffle the horizon, but clear enough for the main fortress's observers to see. They did not charge. They advanced with a terrifying, processional slowness. Mikhailich guided the tank not along the path of least resistance, but along a route that kept them in full view of the bee-works' primary observation cupola for the longest possible time. It was a predator's parade. The OT-34's distinctive, unbalanced silhouette, with its blunt flame projector snout, became a moving icon against the gray landscape. Inside, the crew operated with a cold, ceremonial focus. Pasha kept his eye glued to the periscope, his hand away from the trigger until the precise moment. Nikolai loaded not a high-explosive shell, but a white phosphorus round into the main gun. a weapon of spectacle, not penetration. From the fortress, there was no defensive fire. They were out of effective range for the anti-tank guns, and the machine gunners held their fire, watching, their binoculars undoubtedly fixed on the approaching monster. The silence from the concrete giant was more unnerving than any barrage. It was the silence of a watched audience. The T-34 halted 200 meters from the observation post, well beyond the optimal flame range. It was a deliberate taunt. Then Voronin gave the order for the main gun. The crack of the 85mm was sharp, a single echoing report. The white phosphorus shell struck the ground directly in front of the dugout's entrance. It did not explode with concussive force. It erupted into a raging chemical sun, billowing plumes of brilliant, clinging white smoke that burned with an intensity that seemed to suck the light from the afternoon. It was a signal flare from hell. As the phosphorus inferno burned, Mikhailich edged the tank forward, closing the distance with agonizing, mechanical patience. The men in the observation post, blinded, choked, and trapped by the wall of searing smoke, now heard the grinding approach of the tracks, a sound growing incrementally louder, a mechanical heartbeat counting down. They broke. Two figures, uniforms smoldering, scrambled from a rear exit, stumbling and flailing through the broken trees towards the main fortress. They were perfect messengers. The T-34 did not pursue them. It stopped again. It let them run. It allowed the observers in the bivouac to witness their men's desperate, panicked flight, to see the monstrous tank idling calmly beside the still-burning white pyre. A clear, unspoken statement. We are not in a hurry. We will pick you apart, piece by piece. The next act occurred at dawn the following day. A German patrol, attempting to relay wire communications between strongpoints, was caught in the open by a sudden, short burst of machine gun fire from supporting Russian infantry, pinning them in a shallow crater. The T-34 was called forward. This time, it did not use its main gun or its flamethrower immediately. It simply positioned itself on a slight rise overlooking the crater, its engine off, its turret slowly traversing to point the dark mouth of the projector at the trapped men. It sat there, silent and immobile, for 10 full minutes. The German soldiers, frozen in their shallow grave, could do nothing but stare at the steel beast that held their incineration in its belly. They saw the scars on its armor from the 37mm gun. They saw the ominous, non-standard tube. The anticipation was a torture more exquisite than any flame. Finally, a white handkerchief was tied to a rifle barrel and waved frantically above the crater's rim. The tank did not move. Only when the infantry moved in to take the 5 shell-shocked, weeping men prisoner did the T-34's engine rumble back to life, and it reversed, vanishing behind the rise as silently as it had appeared. The effect on the German side was seismic, and it was measured. Radio intercepts became frantic, filled with coded pleas and warnings about the Flampanzer stalking their sector. A desperate attempt was made to launch a local counterattack with Panzerfaust teams after dark, but it was a ragged, terrified affair. The teams, expecting the beast, fired at shadows, revealing their positions, and were cut down by pre-sighted Russian mortars. The fear had eroded their discipline, turned soldiers into jumpy, trigger-happy phantoms. For the Russian infantry, the spectacle bred a different, more complex dread. They appreciated the breaking of the enemy's nerve, the ground taken without costly charges. but the cold, theatrical cruelty of it settled in their stomachs like a cold stone. The tank crew were no longer fellow soldiers. They were high priests of a new, pitiless religion. Men would nod to them, but their eyes would not meet theirs. They were useful demons, but demons nonetheless. Inside the T-34, the ritual cost its performers. Pasha's hands, once steady as a surgeon's, now developed a faint, constant tremor. He would clean the firing mechanism over and over, a compulsive act to scrub away the psychological residue. Nikolai withdrew further into a shell of silence, his prayers longer, his eyes vacant. Voronin became gaunt, his calculations now focused on the timing of terror, the optimal duration of a pause to maximize psychological collapse. He kept a meticulous log, but the entries were now timetables of despair. 0723, position assumed. 0733, enemy patrol breaks cover. 0745, surrender observed. Mikhailich bore the weight in the marrow of his bones. Driving the tank in these slow, predatory maneuvers required a nerve of frozen steel. Each time he sat motionless in the driver's seat, engine off, hearing the faint, desperate sounds from the German positions, he felt not like a soldier, but like an executioner, offering the condemned a long, last look at the instrument of their death. The power had curdled into something sadistic. They were not just killing the enemy. They were dismantling his soul before taking his life, and in the process, they were etching their own souls with the same cold, precise malice. The dragon was no longer a beast of rage. It had become a creature of cruel, patient, and intelligent horror. And they were chained inside it, feeding it with their own humanity. The ritual of terror had done its work. The outlying defenses of the B-Werk Kugelblitz had fallen silent, abandoned or subdued not by direct assault, but by a creeping paralysis of dread. The fortress itself now stood alone, a concrete island in a churned sea of mud and death, its garrison isolated not just physically by severed communication trenches, but psychologically by the specter of the flame. The final assault was no longer a battle. It was to be an application of terminal force, a clinical excision. The target for the coup de grace was not the main block itself initially, but a critical appendage, a heavily fortified artillery casemate, codenamed Festa Danzig by Russian intelligence, connected to the main structure by a deep underground tunnel. It housed a 75mm anti-tank gun that commanded the only viable approach lane for armor. It had to be silenced, permanently. The order from battalion came with a grim addendum. The garrison had rejected a final surrender ultimatum delivered by loudspeaker. Their response had been a burst of machine gun fire that cut down the political officer sent to parley. The message was clear: no quarter asked, and none would be given. The morning of the attack was windless and cold, the sky a sheet of iron. A heavy artillery preparation began, not the usual scattered barrage, but a focused, tectonic pounding of the earth directly around the casemate. High explosive shells dug craters, not to destroy the concrete, but to churn the ground, to collapse any hidden escape routes or spider holes. Smoke shells laid down a thick, choking bank of gray fog, not to hide the T-34, but to blind the main fortress, to isolate the casemate visually and psychologically. They were creating a stage for a private execution. Mikhailich guided the tank forward through the artificial gloom, the smoke mingling with the cordite fog from the explosions. The world was reduced to the few meters of torn earth visible through his periscope, the roar of their own engine, and the shuddering impacts of their own artillery walking ahead of them. The infantry this time did not advance in a skirmish line. They followed in a tight, grim cluster behind the tank's bulk, not as attackers, but as witnesses and tools for the final, intimate work. They emerged from the smoke 50 meters from the casemate. It was a squarish, ugly block of reinforced concrete, its main gun embrasure a dark, shuttered mouth. Smaller slits for machine guns flanked it. It was silent. The artillery lifted. In the sudden ringing quiet, the only sound was the idle of the T-34's engine and the crunch of boots in mud as the infantry fanned out, taking cover behind the freshly made craters. The casemate remained silent. The garrison was waiting, conserving ammunition, hoping the beast would come into the killing zone of their 75-millimeter gun. Voronin did not oblige. His voice over the intercom was a dry, emotionless rasp. "Gunner, target the main embrasure. Short burst. Force them to button up." Pasha's trembling finger pressed the switch. The jet of flame that roared forth was not the sustained deluge of before. It was a probing, spiteful lance of fire, 3 seconds long. It splashed against the steel shutter of the embrasure, cascading in a waterfall of flame down the concrete face. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The superheated steel of the shutter expanded, warping audibly with a shriek of metal. The fire, seeking any purchase, licked into the vision slits, into the narrow gaps. Inside, they could imagine the sudden, unbearable bloom of heat, the panic as vision blocks cracked, as the air became an oven. A machine gun from one of the side slits fired a frantic, blind burst, tracers wildly off target before falling silent again, choked by the backflow of smoke and heat. Now began the systematic, sadistic dismantling. Voronin directed Mikhailich to maneuver the tank laterally, a slow, crab-like dance around the front of the casemate. At each position, Pasha would unleash another short, precise burst of flame. He targeted not to penetrate, but to seal. Each machine gun slit was baptized in fire, the molten jelly seeping in, fouling the mechanisms, turning the firing chambers into tombs of solidified fire. The concrete, initially gray, blackened, then began to blister and spall under the relentless thermal shock, chunks of it exploding off in pops of superheated debris. But the true horror was for the infantry. On Voronin's signal, they moved forward, not towards the doors, but to the rear of the casemate. Their job was the ventilation shafts and the emergency escape hatches, the fortress's lungs and its last exits. Using crowbars and sledgehammers pried from the engineering squad, they began to smash at the grated covers. From inside, faint, muffled shouts could be heard, the sound of fists pounding against steel from within. As the infantry tore the grates free, other soldiers prepared their tools. Not grenades at first, but smoke canisters. They were dropped down the shafts, followed by tear gas grenades. The goal was not to kill, but to torture, to force the garrison into the heart of the inferno being prepared for them. Coughing, screaming sounds filtered up from the depths, desperate and animalistic. Then came the real grenades. Not one, but several, dropped in succession down the pipes. The hollow, echoing thumps of their detonations, deep within the structure, vibrating through the ground. Each explosion was followed by a silence more terrible than the blast, and then by renewed, weaker screams. Throughout this, the T-34 continued its grim ballet. Mikhailich, following Voronin's cold directions, positioned the tank so its flame projector could now play over the sealed main embrasure for a longer duration. The fire was no longer a jet, but a constant, washing river of liquid heat. The concrete began to glow a dull, hellish red in spots. The smell that permeated the battlefield was indescribable. Burnt chemicals, seared concrete, cooked metal, and now wafting from the shattered ventilation shafts, the unmistakable sweet rotten stench of burning hair and flesh. The execution lasted for 27 minutes. 27 minutes of methodical, industrialized murder. There was no heroic last stand, no final defiant shot. There was only the hiss of the flame, the crunch of tools on metal, the muffled detonations underground, and the dying sounds from within the concrete tomb that faded slowly into an absolute, deafening silence. Finally, Voronin gave the ceasefire order. The flame died. The T-34 sat, its projector smoking, its armor hot to the touch. The infantry around the rear of the casemate stepped back, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. They looked at their hands, at their tools, then at the tank, with a kind of numb revulsion. Mikhailich killed the engine. In the sudden quiet, the silence from the casemate was a physical weight, a void that sucked in all sound and feeling. He opened his driver's hatch, not for tactical reason, but because the air inside the tank, thick with the smell of their own fuel and fear, had become unbreathable. The cold outside air hit him, but it did not cleanse. It carried the finished product of their work, the dense, oily, carnage stench of a cooled crematorium. He did not look at the blackened, smoking block of concrete. He looked at his hands on the controls, the same hands that had driven the beast through its slow, murderous dance. He listened to the silence. It was not the silence of peace or victory. It was the silence of a place where even the ghosts had been incinerated. They had not just killed the garrison of Feste-Danzig. They had erased them from the fabric of the world with a thoroughness that felt blasphemous. The dragon had fed, and its hunger had only grown, and now it lived inside the silence of four men who could no longer hear anything but its echo. The success at Feste-Danzig was a stone dropped into a stagnant pond. The ripples spread, cold and distorting. At the battalion command post, the T-34 crew were noted as exceptionally effective specialists. Their names appeared in a dry operational summary. Captain Gromov, his own infantry losses, now palatable to higher command, thanks to the Flamethrower's brutal efficiency, shook Voronin's hand with a grip that was firm but brief, his eyes avoiding the lieutenant's, as if looking into a cursed mirror. The crew was given a precious 48 hours of supposed rest, relocated to a less exposed cellar in a village just captured. They were given real bread, a jar of thick American stew, and a bottle of medicinal alcohol. The gifts felt like payment for a sin. The rest was an agony of stillness. The roaring silence of the engine's absence was filled by the echoes they carried within. The cellar, though safer, was no sanctuary. It was a cage where their minds replayed the hiss of the flame and the final, suffocating quiet of the casemate on a relentless, torturous loop. Pasha, the technician, the man who believed in systems and mechanics, broke first. His hands, which had once disassembled and reassembled the firing mechanism blindfolded in training, now fumbled with the simple task of spooning stew into his mouth. The fine tremor had become a constant, violent, shake. He would sit for hours, staring at the wall, his lips moving silently, reciting not prayers, but the technical specifications of the ATO-41 system. Pressure ratings, viscosity coefficients, ignition sequence. It was an incantation, a desperate attempt to reduce the horror to clean, manageable numbers. The real world had become too fluid, too monstrous. One night, he woke the others with a choked scream, hallucinating that the sloshing sound of the fire mixture in its internal tank was following him, whispering from the cellar's dark corners. Nikolai, the silent loader, underwent a different transformation. His piety curdled into a dark, fatalistic mysticism. He no longer simply crossed himself. He engaged in elaborate, obsessive rituals of cleansing, scrubbing his hands with snow until they were raw and bleeding, as if trying to remove a stain no one else could see. He began to treat the T-34 itself, not as a machine, but as a possessed idol. He would approach it at dawn and place a small, hard crust of black bread on its front glacis plate, an offering to appease the metal demon. When asked, he would only mutter about debts and the coming reckoning. His strength remained, but it was the strength of an automaton, his motions inside the tank devoid of any human spark, only the dutiful precision of a damned soul serving his sentence. Voronin, the commander, the mathematician, retreated into a labyrinth of cold logic. The human reactions of his crew were now variables to be managed, symptoms of inefficiency. He pored over maps and casualty reports, his calculations shifting subtly. The equation was no longer about enemy neutralized versus resources expended. A new, horrifying metric had inserted itself: the speed of collapse. He noted how the spectacle of flame induced panic faster than bombardment, how a slow advance broke morale more completely than a swift assault. He began to see men, both enemy and chillingly, the following infantry, not as combatants, but as psychological systems to be overloaded and shut down. His logbook entries became chillingly abstract. Optimal terror application requires visual pre-staging. Sensory deprivation, smoke, enhances subsequent thermal trauma impact. He was dissecting damnation with the dispassion of a pathologist. And Mikhailich, the driver, the veteran of the old war, felt the last of his internal foundations crumble. The familiar, almost musical language of the tank, the grind of the gears, the whine of the turret traverse, had become corrupted. Now, in the constant metallic groans and squeaks of the machine, he began to hear other things. The hiss of the flame projector blended with the memory of human screams into a single, perpetual sound in his mind. The clanking of the tracks became the pounding of fists on steel from inside the sealed casemate. He would sit in his driver's seat, engine off, and feel the phantom slosh of the fire mixture tank behind him, like a malignant heartbeat. He was no longer just operating a vehicle, he was fused with a cursed entity, its memories of incineration now his own. The catalyst for the final metamorphosis came not from command, but from the crumbling German line. A chaotic, desperate counterthrust by a ragged battle group of Volkssturm and scattered Wehrmacht remnants aimed to retake a road junction. It was a frenzy of old men and boys, more a suicidal convulsion than a military operation. Russian infantry, caught in the open, were pinned down by surprisingly heavy fire from a cluster of ruined houses. The T-34 was scrambled, its rest cut short. As they rumbled towards the sound of battle, Voronin received a confused, frantic report over the radio. The Germans were intermixed with the buildings. There were no clear lines. The infantry commander was dead. They arrived at the edge of the ruin. Mikhailich saw through his periscope a scene of chaos. Gray-green uniforms flitted between shattered walls and cellars. His own infantry were trapped in a drainage ditch, taking fire from multiple hidden points. It was close, ugly, chaotic work. The kind where the clear, clinical destruction of a bunker was impossible. Voronin's voice cut through the intercom, devoid of its earlier tension, now flat and eerily calm. Driver. Position at the head of the ditch. Gunner, target the building cluster at bearing 270, not the structures, the open ground between them and the riverbank. Mikhailich understood instantly, with a cold splash of nausea that froze his blood. There was no fortress here, no bunker, just men exposed and trying to maneuver. The riverbank was their only conceivable retreat. Pasha, his voice cracking for the first time, protested. Commander, the range, the mixture expenditure. Our own men are... Execute the order, Gunner. Voronin's tone brooked no argument. It was the voice of the equation. Mikhailich's hands moved without his conscious command, steering the beast into position. He was a spectator in his own body. Pasha, with a sob that was swallowed by the engine noise, pressed the switch. The flame that shot forth was not aimed at a building, not at a firing slit. It was a sweeping, horizontal scythe of fire that painted the frozen ground, the shattered cobblestones, the low winter brush between the ruins and the icy river. It created a wall, a dancing, roaring curtain of death, 40 meters wide. It was not meant to kill the Germans in the houses. It was designed to cut off their escape, to herd them, to trap them, between the wall of flame and the advancing Russian infantry, who now, seeing the inferno, rose from the ditch with a vengeful roar. Mikhailich watched, through the periscope, as figures emerged from cover, not to fight, but to flee, only to be met by the impassable thermal barrier. He saw men silhouetted against the orange hell, turning back, hands raised not in surrender, but in a primal, hopeless warding off of the heat. They were not soldiers in that moment. They were animals in a burning forest. The T-34 had ceased to be a weapon against fortifications. It had become a tool of environmental control, a maker of hellscapes, a painter whose only color was fire and whose canvas was human despair. As the flame died and the infantry moved in for the grim, close-quarters work, Mikhailich closed his eyes. The metamorphosis was complete. The crew of the T-34 were no longer even its keepers. They were its organs. The beast had consumed them utterly, and now it saw through their eyes, thought with Voronin's cold logic, acted with Pasha's trembling hands, moved on Mikhailich's instinct, and was fed by Nikolai's silent despair. They were no longer men who used a weapon. They had become the conscious damned will of the dragon itself. And the dragon, having tasted the soft, unarmored terror of the open field, would never be satisfied with concrete again. The breakthrough, when it finally came, was not a thunderous event. It was an anticlimactic crumbling. The German defensive line, its nerve centers burned out, its soldiers haunted by the specter of the serpent's kiss, collapsed like rotten timber. One morning, after a probing attack met with only scattered desultory fire, the forward scouts signaled the way was clear. The Beaver Kugelblitz stood silent, its armored doors hanging open on broken hinges, its dark interior exhaling a final cold breath of decay and ashes. The war moved past it, a river flowing around a blackened stone. For the OT-34 and its crew, there were no ceremonies. The order came as a terse radio message. They were to disengage and proceed to a rear assembly area near the captured town of Preußisch Eylau for refit and regrouping. The word hung in the air, meaningless. There was no group to rejoin. They were a unit of 4, orbiting a shared, unspeakable gravity. The journey back was a voyage through a landscape they had helped create. They drove not through a battlefield, but through a charnel house in the final stages of cooling. The snow, which had once been pure, was now a filthy quilt of soot, discarded equipment, and other darker stains. They passed silent forests of burnt matchstick trees, fields littered with the hollowed-out carcasses of tanks and wagons. The sky remained a constant, oppressive gray, as if the very heavens were stained by the smoke of 1,000 pyres. Mikhailich drove automatically, his mind numb, his body responding to the terrain with the detached skill of a sleepwalker. The sloshing of the fire mixture in its tank was now a familiar, morbid lullaby. They approached the assembly area, a field on the outskirts of the shattered town. The scene was one of organized chaos, the metabolism of a victorious army. Columns of fresh infantry marched forward, their faces still holding the blank tension of men, yet to be tested. Lines of bedraggled German prisoners, wrapped in whatever rags they could find, shuffled under guard towards makeshift cages. Repair crews swarmed over damaged tanks and artillery pieces. The air buzzed with the sounds of engines, shouted orders, and the distant whine of a power saw cutting through metal. Their OT-34, as it rumbled off the main road and onto the churned mud of the field, did not belong to this world. It was a relic from a deeper, more savage circle of the war. Its armor was a canvas of scars. The deep, star-shaped gouge from the 37mm shell, the smaller peppered dimples of machine gun fire, the broad, sweeping stains of soot that radiated from the projector's mouth, baked into the steel by its own hellish breath. It moved with a tired, heavy limp, a legacy of the damaged turret ring and overstressed suspension. Mikhailich brought the tank to a halt near a row of other T-34s undergoing repair. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was a physical relief and a psychological void. One by one, they emerged from their hatches, blinking in the flat gray light like nocturnal creatures dragged into the day. They moved stiffly, their bodies aching with a fatigue that had seeped into their bones. They did not look at each other. As they began the silent routine tasks of securing the vehicle, checking external damage, topping up the coolant from a dented can, a column of German prisoners was herded past their position, moving parallel to the road. There were hundreds of them. A river of gray and field green, their heads bowed, their eyes fixed on the mud in front of their feet. The guards walked alongside, young Russian soldiers with sharp, vigilant eyes, their submachine guns held loosely, but ready. The river of prisoners slowed to a halt, a traffic jam in the aftermath of war. And so, for several long minutes, the crew of the OT-34 stood beside their machine, and the defeated soldiers of the Wehrmacht stood a mere 20 meters away, separated only by a rusted coil of wire and an immeasurable gulf of experience. Then it happened. A prisoner, an older man with a bandaged head and the hollow cheeks of starvation, glanced up. His eyes swept over the repair yard. over the Russian tanks, and then stopped. They locked onto the T-34, not on the crew, but on the tank itself. His gaze traveled from the distinctive thickened snout of the flame projector, down the soot-stained front plate, to the deep, brutal dent on the turret side. His eyes widened. A low murmur, like a wind through dead grass, passed through the prisoners near him. Heads turned. Dozens. Then scores of eyes lifted from the mud and found the tank. There was no hatred in those looks, no anger. There was a recognition so profound, it bordered on the sacred. It was the look of men seeing the physical embodiment of their deepest, most secret terror. They were not looking at a vehicle. They were looking at a myth made steel. They were looking at Der Schlangenkuss, the serpent's kiss. The stories had traveled ahead of them, faster than the advance, and now here was the beast itself, resting, wounded, but undeniably real. Mikhailich, caught in the act of wiping grease from a track link, slowly straightened. He turned and met the gaze of the prisoners. He looked from their gaunt, haunted faces to the monster he had driven, to the scars they were now silently cataloging. He saw in their eyes not the reflection of a victor, but of a fellow survivor of an atrocity. They had endured it from the outside. He had lived it from within. In that silent exchange, there were no winners, only witnesses to a specific kind of damnation. The tank had been a weapon against them, but now it stood as a monument to a horror that transcended sides, a horror they had all, in different ways, been forced to consume. A sharp command from a guard broke the spell. The column of prisoners lurched forward again, the faces turning back to the mud, the moment of silent communion severed. Voronin cleared his throat, a dry, empty sound. "We are to report to the command tent for debriefing," he said, his voice stripped of all calculation, merely a statement of fact. He walked away, not looking back at the tank. Pasha followed, his trembling hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched as if against a cold only he could feel. Nikolai paused. He took one last, long look at the T-34, then turned and walked not toward the command tent, but toward the edge of the field, toward a half-destroyed church spire in the distance, as if pulled by a different duty. Mikhailich remained. He placed a hand on the tank's cooling armor. It was still warm from the drive, a fading animal heat. He looked at the column of prisoners disappearing into the haze, then at the fresh troops marching up to the line, their faces full of a tense, ignorant purpose. They would never know. They would never understand the weight of the soot, the meaning of the scars, the language of the sloshing sound inside the hull. He turned and walked away, leaving the T-34 standing alone in the churned field. It was no longer his. It belonged to the myth now. It was a story the prisoners would tell, a ghost that would haunt the ruins of East Prussia long after the guns fell silent. And the four men who had been its soul, they were ghosts too, walking away in different directions, carrying the silence of the flame inside them into whatever peace a burning world could still offer. The dragon was dormant, but its keepers were forever scorched by its breath, their souls etched with the same dark patterns as the steel they left behind in the melting snow.